This picture was taken in 1899. It shows an older brother, around 8 years old, gently holding his little sister's hand. Both children are dressed in formal Victorian clothes. The boy looks straight into the camera with a serious face, while his sister leans her head against his shoulder. It is a warm, sweet moment that families of that era often treasured. For more than 100 years, this photo stayed tucked inside a family album. It seemed like nothing more than a charming old portrait. But in 2019, during a digital restoration, something unexpected began to appear once the image was cleaned. What surfaced changed how the photo was understood. In March 2019, Sarah Mitchell was sorting through the attic of her grandmother's home in rural Pennsylvania after her grandmother passed away. Among old clothes, dishes, and yellowed papers, she found a worn leather photo album that had clearly aged for more than a century. Inside were portraits from the late 1800s and early 1900s, stiff family poses, wedding photos, and children dressed in their best outfits. Sarah, a 34-year-old history teacher who loved researching family history, decided to digitize everything before the pictures were lost to time. One photo stood out to her right away. A faded handwritten note read, "Thomas and Eliza Whitmore, September 14, 1899. The image showed two children. The older boy, Thomas, looked about 8. He wore a neat Victorian suit with a high-collared shirt. His hair was carefully parted, and he held a steady, serious gaze at the camera, just like many children did in formal portraits of that era. Beside him sat his younger sister, Eliza, who appeared to be 5 or 6. She wore a white dress trimmed with lace, the type of outfit families save for important days. Her blonde curls hung over her shoulders, and she rested her head gently on her brother's shoulder. Thomas held her hand firmly, their fingers linked a way that showed how close they were. Sarah felt this was the perfect photo to restore first. She reached out to Marcus Chun, a digital restorer known for working with antique images. Marcus agreed to take on the project, especially since the photo had held up better than many of its age. He started by scanning it at very high resolution, capturing every crease in the paper and every age spot. Then he began removing discoloration, watermarks, and fading while bringing back contrast the picture had lost over time. Most of the damage was in the lower right corner, where water stains had caused heavy deterioration. As Marcus cleared away each layer of damage, something unusual caught his attention. Behind the children, in the background, a shape began to appear that had not been noticeable in the original print. Curious, Marcus zoomed in and increased the clarity to get a closer look at what was hidden in the shadows. Marcus adjusted the image settings, sharpened the details, and then stopped cold. Something in the photo made him freeze. He stared at the screen, trying to make sure he was not seeing a mistake caused by the restoration tools. But it was not an error. It was real. Whatever had been hidden for more than a century was now visible once the contrast was corrected. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone and called Sarah. "You need to come to my studio right now," he said. "There's something in this photo you're not expecting. It changes the whole meaning of the image." Sarah arrived less than an hour later. Marcus guided her straight to his monitor, where the restored photo filled the screen. "Look at the picture first," he said. "Tell me what you notice." Sarah studied the restored image. The colors were richer, the details sharper. She could see the tiny freckles on Thomas's nose and the fine lashes framing Eliza's eyes. The fabric of their clothes looked clearer than ever. The restoration was beautiful. "It looks amazing," she said softly. "Just how I hoped it would turn out." "Check the background," Marcus said, his voice tight. Behind Eliza, to the left, Sarah leaned in. At first, everything looked normal, a dark curtain and part of the studio backdrop. Then Marcus zoomed in and increased the contrast again. Something appeared. Hidden in the shadows behind the curtain was a faint outline of an adult face. It was not part of the studio setup. It was an actual person standing behind the children, barely noticeable without the restored details. "Oh my gosh," Sarah whispered. "There's someone back there." "Hold on," Marcus said. "That's not all." He moved to another part of the photo, near the lower edge where the children were seated. Now that the image was cleaned, another detail stood out clearly. an adult hand reaching in from outside the frame and holding Eliza's arm just below where her brother held her hand. A chill ran through Sarah as she saw it. "And look at this," Marcus added. He zoomed in on Eliza's eyes. With the restored clarity, it was obvious that she was not looking straight ahead. Her gaze was turned toward the hidden figure behind the curtain, and her expression, now visible after so many years, showed clear fear. "This photo is what it looks like," Marcus said quietly. "Thomas isn't holding her hand just to be sweet. Look at how tight his grip is." He zoomed in on their hands. With a better resolution, Sarah could see that Thomas's knuckles were tense and pressed hard from holding on so tightly. Then she noticed something else. Eliza's head was not resting gently on her brother. It was tilted in an odd, uncomfortable angle, as if someone had placed it that way. "Who was that person in the back?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Marcus replied. But whoever it was did not want to be noticed. They stayed behind the curtain, and from the way the kids looked, especially Eliza and that hand on her arm, something was not right in that moment. "Sarah, I don't think this picture shows a happy family moment," Marcus said softly. Sarah felt her stomach twist. "Then what do you think it shows?" Marcus stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "I think something serious was happening to this little girl, and I think her brother was trying to shield her. That grip isn't gentle. It looks protective, maybe even like he was trying to hold her steady." Sarah sank into a chair, unable to look away from the image she once found touching and now felt uneasy about. "We need to find out what happened to them," she said. "We need to know who that person in the background was and what was really going on." They started right away. Since the photo was taken in 1899, Sarah began checking public records. She knew the children were part of her own family line, though her grandmother had only mentioned the Whitmores in brief stories and never in much detail, as if something about that side of the family had always been quietly avoided. She searched birth records first. Thomas Whitmore was born on March 3rd, 1891, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father was Edward Whitmore, who worked in a textile mill, and his mother was Catherine Whitmore, whose maiden name was Harrison. Eliza's birth record was harder to track down, but Sarah finally located it. Eliza was born June 12, 1894, also in Pittsburgh, to the same parents. That matched the ages they suspected when the photo was taken in September 1899. Thomas was 8 and Eliza was 5. Then Sarah found something that made her freeze. In March 1900, only half a year after the photo was taken, there was a death record for Catherine Whitmore. Cause of death, pneumonia. She was only 29. Sarah pressed on. What happened to the children afterward? The 1901 census showed Thomas, now 10, living with his mother's brother in Philadelphia. But Eliza wasn't listed there. After widening the search, Sarah found Eliza recorded at St. Margaret Home for Orphan Girls in New York City, a church-run institution. "They separated them," Sarah whispered. "After their mother passed away, they were sent to different places." She kept digging and soon found old newspaper entries from the Library of Congress archives. A small article from April 1900, just 1 month after Catherine's death, caught her eye. The headline read, "Local Review of Child Conditions." The short piece mentioned that officials had begun looking into the home of Mr. Edward Whitmore and that the children had been placed under protective care for a period of time. The wording was polite, but clearly pointed concerns in the household. Sarah reread it several times. The meaning was clear, even if the language of the era was cautious. Authorities had stepped in to keep the children safe. But what had triggered that? She searched further. Another small update from June 1900 mentioned that Edward Whitmore had been formally warned by officials for behavior that was considered inappropriate for someone caring for minors. His custody of the children had been permanently ended. The pieces were starting to fit together. While Sarah worked on the family records, Marcus researched photography studios in Pittsburgh around 1899. He learned the picture had been taken at J. Patterson & Sons, a long-standing photography studio in the city. He shared the information with Sarah, and both of them understood they were at the beginning of a much larger story. Studios from that time kept very detailed notes, Marcus told Sarah. They wrote down who booked each session, and often added comments about how the appointment went. "Do you think you can find those notes?" Sarah asked. "I already did," Marcus said, his face serious. "At least the parts that survived." He explained that the Patterson Studios archives had been donated to the local historical society in the 1970s. He had visited that morning to look through them. Marcus handed Sarah a photocopy from the studio's log dated September 14, 1899. The entry said, "Whitmore family. Children's portrait commissioned by Mr. E. Whitmore." Note: session was difficult. Children were visibly upset. Younger girl was crying. Client insisted on standing behind the backdrop the entire time to keep order. Recommend declining future sessions with this client. Sarah and Marcus stared at each other. "The face in the background," Sarah said quietly. "It's Edward Whitmore." "And he wasn't hiding by mistake," Marcus added. The photographer even wrote that he insisted on standing behind the curtain. He was probably pressuring the kids to stay still. Over the next several weeks, Sarah threw herself into deeper research. Each new discovery made the situation even more concerning. She learned that Edward Whitmore had a reputation in the community for having a harsh temper. Police notes from the time mentioned public disturbances and issues related to alcohol. A report from 1898 mentioned that a neighbor had filed a complaint about violence in the home, although nothing had come from it, which was common at a time when laws protecting families were limited. After Catherine's death in March 1900, things seemed to have gotten worse. Concerned for Thomas and Eliza, Catherine's brothers contacted early child protection officials. An inspection of the home revealed unsafe conditions and signs the children had been mistreated. The children were removed right away. Thomas was sent to Philadelphia to live with their mother's brother, Robert Harrison. But Robert already had a large family and limited space, so he could not also take in Eliza. She was placed at St. Margaret's Home for Orphan Girls. Sarah located the orphanage's surviving records. An entry from April 1900 described Eliza as a 6-year-old who spoke very little, kept to herself, and showed clear signs she needed extra care and support. More notes showed that progress was slow. It took about 6 months for her to begin talking regularly again. Then Sarah found something that brought a moment of relief in the middle of the sad history. The orphanage staff had documented that Thomas never stopped visiting his sister. Even though he was only 10, he rode the train from Philadelphia to New York City once a month to see her. One record said, "Older brother continues to visit every month. Girl shows noticeable improvement after each visit." When Thomas turned 14 in 1905, he found work at a textile mill. Sarah discovered that he saved as much money as he could. By 1907, when Eliza turned 13, Thomas had finally saved enough to bring her out of the orphanage. He rented a small room, and the two of them moved in together. He was 16. She was 13. They were finally reunited. The 1911 census listed both of them living in a small apartment in Philadelphia. Thomas worked as a loom operator, and Eliza worked in a shop. They were doing everything they could to build a stable life. Sarah uncovered one more detail. In 1910, Thomas had filed paperwork to legally change their last name. Both Thomas and Eliza had filed to change their last name from Whitmore to Harrison, choosing their mother's family name instead. The request was approved. From there, Sarah followed their lives through later census entries. Thomas Harrison married in 1915 at age 24. Eliza Harrison married the next year at age 22. Both had children and lived long lives, passing away in the 1960s in their 70s. One detail stayed with Sarah more than anything else. According to family records and the obituary she located, Thomas and Eliza lived within 2 blocks of each other for their entire adult lives. Even after starting their own families, they remained close in a way that never faded. The little boy who had held his sister's hand so tightly in that 1899 picture had grown into a man who continued looking out for her for the rest of his life. And that photograph, the one Sarah's grandmother kept but never spoke about, was not simply a sweet portrait of 2 children from a different era. It captured an 8-year-old trying to protect his 5-year-old sister during a difficult moment. It showed the fear in a young girl's eyes. It showed a hidden figure in the background who shaped the children's lives in painful ways. For more than a century, the truth was softened by the fading and damage on the original print, leaving behind only the appearance of a peaceful Victorian scene. Modern restoration brought out details that had always been there, waiting to be seen. After finishing her research, Sarah faced a hard choice. What should she do with all of this? She could keep it private, as her grandmother had. She could close the album and set the past aside. Everyone involved had been gone for decades. What would sharing it change? But as a history teacher, Sarah knew that painful stories often stay hidden unless someone chooses to bring them forward. Silence helps no one, not even long after the events have passed. So she decided to tell the story. She wrote an article for a Historical Society journal explaining her research and the restoration process. She included the restored photo, but blurred the background face, not to protect the person, but because she felt showing that detail was unnecessary to explain what happened. The article spread quickly. History blogs shared it, and before long, the story reached far beyond the original publication. Readers were shaken by what had been uncovered, but many were also touched by the strength the children showed throughout their lives. Despite everything they faced, Thomas and Eliza survived, rebuilt, and created happier futures than anyone might have expected from the moment captured in that old photograph. Sarah received hundreds of messages after sharing the story. Many came from people who had uncovered difficult family histories of their own. Others were from adults who had experienced childhood mistreatment and said the story gave them comfort. They said it reminded them that healing is possible, that siblings can look out for each other, and that kindness can survive even in hard times. One message affected Sarah more than any other. It came from a woman in Oregon named Jennifer Harrison, a direct descendant of Eliza. Jennifer explained that her grandmother had been Eliza's daughter, and she grew up hearing warm stories about Grandma Eliza and Uncle Thomas. The two had always shared an unusually deep bond. My grandmother used to say they were close in a way no one fully understood. Jennifer wrote, they had gone through something difficult together when they were young, something they never explained, but it made them stay connected for life. Now I understand why. Thank you for finding this history. It fills in so many missing pieces for our family. Sarah and Jennifer eventually met in person. Their visit brought together two sides of the family that had grown apart over the generations. Jennifer brought photos of Eliza later in life, smiling, surrounded by children and grandchildren, looking peaceful and content. She had endured a painful start, but she moved forward, grew stronger, and built a life filled with love. Marcus, the digital restorer who first noticed the hidden details in the photo, began giving talks about why photograph restoration matters. He spoke about how old images often contain information that no one recognized at the time, but that modern tools can bring forward. Every photograph holds a story, he said during one presentation. Sometimes the most important part is the piece no one saw before, the part that stayed hidden for decades until someone finally brought it forward. The restored photograph was eventually donated to the Smithsonian's collection. It became part of an exhibit about the development of child protection laws in the United States. The display helped explain how care standards changed over time and why it's important to pay attention to the well-being of young people. Whenever Sarah travels to Washington, D.C., she visits the exhibit. She stands in front of the photo of 8-year-old Thomas holding his 5-year-old sister's hand, while a figure stands quietly behind them, and she thinks about how easily the truth could have remained unknown. The picture had been in her grandmother's attic the entire time, appearing gentle and ordinary, without restoration tools, without curiosity, without the willingness to look closer. The real story would never have surfaced. The photograph was never just a charming moment between siblings. It showed a young boy trying to support his little sister during a stressful moment. It showed the worry in a child's eyes. And it showed someone standing in the background who had shaped their early lives in ways not visible at first glance. More than 120 years later, careful restoration revealed details that had been hidden. Sometimes the most important truths sit quietly in front of us, waiting for someone willing to look a little deeper. The story of Thomas and Eliza eventually became much more than a restored photograph or a surprising discovery in an old attic. It grew into a reminder how the past can hold quiet truths that wait for the right moment, the right person, or the right set of eyes to finally be understood. When Sarah first opened that dusty album, She never expected it would lead to one of the most meaningful journeys of her life. She only wanted to save a few worn pictures from fading away forever. Instead, she uncovered a history that reshaped how she saw her own family and changed her view of the role regular people play in keeping history alive. The photograph itself began as a gentle moment frozen in time, at least at first glance. Two children sitting close together, well-dressed, silent, and posed in a way families of that era expected. But the truth inside that image had gone unseen for generations. It took time, patience, and technology to reveal what had been hidden. It took curiosity and compassion to understand the lies behind the still image. It took courage to accept that the past is not always what it seems. When Sarah learned the truth, she struggled with what to do next. It is not easy to face dark parts of a family's past, especially ones that were never spoken out loud. But as she continued her research, she realized the story did not end with struggle. It continued with resilience. It continued with two siblings who stayed connected against all odds. That alone made the story worth telling. As Sarah and Jennifer exchanged messages and eventually met in person, the weight of those discoveries began to shift. The story no longer felt like a painful secret uncovered by accident. It began to feel like a bridge between generations, a bridge that had been missing and was finally rebuilt. Jennifer brought photographs, documents, and small items that had belonged to Eliza when she was older. Seeing those pieces brought comfort. Eliza's later years were filled with warmth, family, laughter, and the kind of steady happiness she never had as a child. She grew into someone who cared deeply for her children and grandchildren. She trusted them. She smiled often. She enjoyed her life. The heavy chapter at the start of her story did not define the many years that followed. Thomas built a stable life as well. He worked hard, supported his sister any way he could, and stayed close to her even after they both married and raised families. Their bond was not built on fear or survival alone. As adults, they shared birthdays, holidays, small daily moments, and the kind of natural closeness that grows when two people choose to stay in each other's lives. The connection they formed in youth found new meaning in their older years. It became a source of comfort rather than pressure. They were not defined by their childhood. They were shaped by it, but not limited by it. The more Sarah learned, the more she understood that the real story of Thomas and Eliza was not simply about what they went through. It was about what they did afterward. It was about how they rebuilt themselves and helped each other move forward. It was about strength that comes from care, responsibility, and family ties that last far beyond childhood. When the Smithsonian accepted the restored photograph, Sarah felt a mix of pride and humility. She knew the story had grown larger than her own family. It had become part of a wider conversation about how children were treated in the past, how laws changed because they needed to, and how important it is to look closely at history so that important lessons are not forgotten. The photograph gained new meaning as a piece of public history. It was no longer just a family keepsake. It was evidence of how far society had come and a reminder of why continued awareness matters. Visitors who saw the photograph in the museum often reacted the same way Sarah had. At first, they saw two children dressed neatly in clothing from long ago. But when they read the caption and learned the story behind the image, the way they viewed the photograph changed. They leaned in. They studied the children's hands. They looked at the background. They paid attention. They began to see the layers that had been missed for more than a century. By the time they stepped away, they carried a deeper understanding of the time period and what many children quietly endured. The more the story was told, the more messages Sarah received from people who had discovered similar experiences, either in their own families or through old documents of their relatives. Some had found journals or letters. Others had discovered photographs that suddenly made sense after hearing about the Whitmore children. Many wrote to say that knowing Thomas and Eliza survived gave them hope. Hope that difficult beginnings do not decide the rest of a person's story. Hope that kindness can last even when hardship tries to overwhelm it. Hope that family bonds can lift people forward. This was why Sarah felt confident in her choice to share the story. It was not to expose anyone. It was not to reopen old wounds. It was to acknowledge a truth that had been ignored for too long and to honor the strength of two children who supported each other through it. It was to give credit to their journey and to allow their resilience to help others who needed it. Looking back, Sarah sometimes thought about how close the whole truth had come to being lost forever. If she had not opened that album, if she had not chosen to digitize the photographs, if Marcus had not taken such care in the restoration, none of the hidden details would have come to light. The story would have remained nothing more than a fading picture with silent expressions and a simple caption. It made her understand how fragile history can be. It also made her value the role ordinary people play in uncovering it. The experience changed Marcus too. His work with antique photographs had always been important to him, but this project reminded him that restoration was not just about repairing images. It was about revealing truth. It was about honoring real lives. He continued to give presentations not only about technique, but about responsibility. He encouraged people to look at old photographs with care, curiosity, and respect. He encouraged them to ask questions. He encouraged them to listen to what the image might be trying to say. One of his talks focused on how easy it is to overlook small details. He explained that pictures from long ago were often staged in a way that hid real feelings. Children were told to sit still, keep their hands folded, and avoid smiling. Adults chose the poses. Adults decided what looked proper. But the camera sometimes captured moments that slipped past the surface, moments that told a different story. Those were the details that mattered most. As Sarah continued her life as a teacher, she brought the lesson of Thomas and Eliza into her classroom, not the personal story itself, but the broader message about looking deeper and paying attention to the humanity behind historical records. Her students learned that history is not only made up of major events. It is made up of everyday people, families, and choices. They learned that small acts of support, like a brother holding his sister's hand, can shape a lifetime. Whenever Sarah visited the Smithsonian, she paused in front of the photograph and thought about how a moment captured in 1899 could still reach people more than a century later. She thought about how powerful it was that a single image could carry so much meaning, both painful and hopeful. She thought about Thomas, who never stopped caring for his sister. She thought about Eliza, who rebuilt her life and found joy again. She thought about how their courage deserved to be remembered. In the end, the photograph became more than a record of a difficult moment. It became a testament to the strength of two children who had each other when they needed it most. It became a reminder that even when shadows hide the truth, time and persistence can bring it forward. It showed that hardship does not erase the possibility of a full and meaningful life. The story of Thomas and Eliza stands today as a quiet but powerful message for anyone who takes the time to learn it. It tells us that someone can begin life in fear and still grow into a person who loves deeply. It shows that a single act of protection can echo through decades. And it proves that even when something is hidden, patience, honesty, and care can bring it into the light. Their photograph, once damaged and nearly forgotten, now reaches countless people. It reminds them that history is living, personal, and shaped by the struggles and courage of ordinary families. It reminds us all to look closer, to ask questions, and to never underestimate the strength that can rise from even the most difficult beginnings.